our guest for tonight. This is Luke. Welcome, Luke.
Thanks for having me on, Caleb. I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Luke is from the Boston area, and he has a very interesting YouTube channel in which he gets into some very interesting questions of theology and other points. Do you want to introduce yourself, Luke? I've got your channel here that people can subscribe to, Seeking the 12 Gates.
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much once again. My name is Luke. I'm a unificationist, a follower of the late Reverend Moon and Hak Jahan Moon, who's still alive right now. I am from the Boston area. My channel focuses mainly on theology from the unificationist perspective, which I would argue is a more universal perspective than most religions have. And that's kind of my area, which may be very different than what you might have been expecting if you tuned into Caleb's stream, because Center for Political Innovation, let's talk about the economy, let's talk about politics, let's talk about what's going on in the world. Why is this you know young person who makes theology videos on the stream? I think every part of society has something to offer, and what's going on with the Unification Church in places like South Korea is something that is not just of interest to me and unificationists, but is perking the interest of many in the world. And we're going to talk about that and probably some other things, but that's me, a little bit about me. And yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, let's just talk about that. So, Dr. Hak Jahan, who is the leader of the unification movement around the world, based in South Korea, widow of the late Reverend Sun Myung Moon, known as True Mother, Mother of Peace. She has been held since the fall, right, in pretrial detention. She's out right now to seek medical care, from what I understand. They gave her 9 days out of this pretrial detention, but her criminal case is still ongoing. And to many, many people, including myself, I've been to many, educational events about this and looked into it. This looks like just blatant politically motivated religious persecution. Do you want to talk some about the case, kind of give people a background on what's going on?
Sure. So Hak Jahan is being accused of bribery of political officials using church funds, which in South Korea, religious organizations are not allowed to involve themselves financially or otherwise in politics, period. There's a very, in my opinion, unfriendly separation of church and state, which is a bit different than the United States because it's a more friendly separation of church and state. The government doesn't endorse any religion, but it, very clearly encourages its, expression of religion from the people. But essentially, those are the charges that Hak Jahan is being accused of. Other church officials, one name in the news a lot recently, Yoon Young Ho, is being accused of directly doing the deed. But the accusation is that Hak Jahan, as the leader of the movement, ordered people like him to engage in this bribery and embezzlement of political officials. The evidence in the case, however, keeps falling apart. There's a few days ago a phone call recording of Yoon Young Ho that was released by Family Federation in Korea, which basically has him stating flat out that Hak Jahan Moon never told him to do any of this and that she can't find out. And yet, despite the evidence against what the prosecution is saying, she's still being held in detention. And not just that, pretrial detention, which, we can't be too quick to put our American judgments on other societies, right? Korea's legal system, their conviction rates, they're all different. Their precedents are different. So we have to acknowledge that. But what it does not excuse, in my view, is the gross inhumanity of her detention, because she's 83 now. She has several health problems. She most recently had a heart problem. She has eye problems. She has knee problems. And yet she's in a really small cell. She can't have a wheelchair in that cell, which means she has to crawl everywhere. She's barely been let out for any medical treatment. Besides this time, the only time was for a few days for like an emergency glaucoma surgery. And her health condition, even according to, and this was just in Chosun Daily's, their newspaper in Korea, Korean newspaper, the legal team for Hak Jahan revealed that, and I have it right in front of me, so I'll just read it to you guys, that quote, management within the detention facility is impossible, and she is at a life-threatening stage. And it was the medical opinion which was needed for the judge to grant this, temporary release for medical treatment. The medical opinion stated that, quote, if a fall occurs while she is taking anticoagulants, there's a direct risk of a cerebral hemorrhage, and continued detention could lead to irreversible consequences.
Wow.
Irreversible consequences. And yet the government of South Korea has just held her there, told her to sit there while the trial is dragged along and evidence mounts that she did not break the law or do anything wrong. And so that's essentially what's going on right now. Luckily, she's been released temporarily, but the problem is it's only for 9 days. If you know anything about, healthcare for elderly people, people of her age and with those health conditions need constant medical care, not necessarily at a hospital, although it's come to that because she's been denied access to medical care for so long, but a dedicated nurse, a home health care aide, these are things that people of her age need given her conditions, and she's being denied that for little to no reason.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a global trend now that, like, in a lot of countries, when one side wins the election, they then have to put the other side in prison. And that this is related to the attempted coup that happened in South Korea by the outgoing previous president. And now the other party is in office and they're going after people that they allege are linked to the other party. But then it looks like, Dr. Hak Jahan is linked to both parties. She has friends on both sides, and that this started out as some kind of political attempt to persecute the other party, but it's just kind of aimed at her, and they're playing up a lot of stereotypes and hysteria that's been whipped up against the church over the decades that have gone on. I know the church was recently dissolved in Japan, for example. Do you want to talk about that some?
Yeah, yeah. And just to echo your point, first of all, I am not in support of the previous administration's and the previous president's coup attempt. It was
Yeah.
bogus. It was absurd. Even, people on the conservative side of the aisle in South Korea are like, why the heck did he do that? Members of his own cabinet were shocked. But it is very political. The new administration has targeted anyone associated with the previous administration. Shincheonji Church, for example, Pastor Hyun Sung Bo, for example. And yet, like you just said, the Unification Church, Hak Jahan, tied to both parties. That narrative fell apart. Hak Jahan told them to do it. That's falling apart now. She's still there, though. So, and with regard to Japan, yes, the church, barring a, frankly, miracle Supreme Court decision, will be dissolved because, once again, the association of the Unification Church into the politics surrounding Japan and the assassination of Shinzo Abe. And the, assassin was claiming to be a former second generation member of the Unification Church, and that he was angry that his mom was coerced into donating large sums of money to the church, and that because Shinzo Abe supported the church, he was someone in his radicalized mind needed to be taken out. And there were even reports that one of the targets of this assassin was Hak Jahan herself. So the worrying trend for me is the targeting of certain people or groups who maybe have disagreements, maybe are unpopular in the society, but at the root for a politically motivated reason, because the person or the group is just against your party and they have some sort of influence in the government. Because that's the argument for dissolving the Unification Church on the other side of the political aisle, which is that they say the Unification Church is a harmful influence on society. Well, what defines harmful? Is
Right.
it because you don't agree with the other side? Granted, coercive donation practices have been proven, and those are wrong. And I've called them out so many times on my channel
Yeah,
that
well, if we
those
were
are
going to
wrong.
outlaw a church because somebody in it did something bad, wouldn't we have outlawed the Catholic Church about 1,000 times after all their child molesting scandals and all of that? I mean, you can't outlaw a religion because somebody in it did something wrong. That's just a ridiculous precedent. But continue, yeah.
No, that's so important.
Yeah.
There's a difference between going after the person or the group of people and holding an institution accountable. That's one thing. That's something
Yeah.
that should always happen. That's the government's duty to its people. It's another thing to just flat out take out an institution that the ruling party in government doesn't like just because some people in that institution did wrong. The Catholic Church, I mean, beyond all the financial stuff that has gone on within the Catholic Church's history, within the last several decades, you've had the priest abuse scandals. Are we targeting the entire Catholic Church and asking it to be dissolved? No, nor should we. We should
Right.
hold everyone that allowed this horror to occur within the Catholic Church. Similarly, I've called that everyone who allowed for the coercive donation practices of the Unification Church and every high-ranking leader in Korea which engaged in bribery and embezzlement against Korean law, such as Yoon Young Ho, who has admitted that he did it in part to you know further his own gains, should be held accountable, and I'm glad.
Yeah.
But to cross in the line of, okay, take out the religious institution, that's where we have a big problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, I got interested in the Unification Church, especially after the killing of Shinzo Abe, because I work in Russian media. I've been to Russia a number of times and such, and the Russian special military operation in Ukraine happened, right, and it started happening, and there was this hysteria of like hatred for Russia, oppose Russia, and Shinzo Abe, he wasn't supporting Russia in Ukraine. He didn't endorse the military operation, but he said, I don't agree with cutting off Russia, and that he and Putin had a history of like they were just friends. And so then he was no longer president, and he was speaking on the streets of Japan. This is a former president, right, who's surrounded by Secret Service and all of that. And he's speaking on the street, and somebody shoots him, and they shoot him with a homemade gun, right? Did you see that? It was a homemade gun. The guy made the gun with a 3D printer.
And in
And
Japan, that's even more difficult than the United States. Their gun laws are way stricter.
yeah,
That's
so
that's
this guy makes
crazy.
a homemade gun, and he gets 2 shots out of it, right? I mean, you can't get 2 shots out of a homemade gun. I guess it was double barreled, and he kills the prime minister of Japan, the former prime minister, one of the most popular politicians in Japan. And then on top of that, I in my mind, I was thinking like, okay, so let's say that like a very popular, beloved American political figure was killed because they were associated with Buddhists. Well, wouldn't everyone's Facebook profile immediately change to a Buddhist symbol, and everyone would be like outside of Buddhist temples, lighting candles, singing, "Give peace a chance" or something like that? So you'd think,
Buddhist symbol in everyone's profile.
yeah, you'd think that there would be just a huge outwave of sympathy for the Unification Church after this politician was killed for allegedly associating. But yet it was the opposite. The mainstream media in Japan adopted the narrative of the murderer and basically was saying, well, the murderer is right. And this guy kills a former president, and a beloved former president at that, a very popular former president. And the media says, oh, well, this guy is right. And everything he says about this church that he's mad at is right, and then they use that to go after the church. That doesn't make sense to me, right? But then if you line that up with Shinzo Abe not agreeing with the hatred for Russia, I know that recently Shinzo Abe was his widow. About a year ago, she went to Russia, and Russian President Putin actually gave her his personal limousine as a gift, right? So it seems to me there's something bigger going on here, and that for a long time, the Unification Church has been targeted by these deprogrammer networks, right? These people that are involved in all kinds of illegal activities themselves, like kidnapping people, holding them against their will, trying to, basically browbeat their religion out of them. This has been going on for decades. And I guess there were some court cases, but in the 70s, it was particularly intense that they were like kidnapping people and all of that. And I exposed on this YouTube channel and in a book that I wrote that one of the people that was heavily involved in that was running some leftist YouTube channels, a guy named Steve Hassan, right? That he was an advisor to what was called BreadTube, which was Vosh and Thought Slime and ContraPoints. And he was basically advising them on how to write their videos. And I wrote a book saying that. And so then I saw what happened, what played out in Japan. And I thought, this is very, very interesting. And that's what led me about 3 years ago to walk into the Manhattan Family Church and shake hands with Reverend Milhan Stevens and say, look, we both want peace on the Korean Peninsula. I've been to Russia many times. I've met North Korean folks in Russia. I know that, Dr. Hak Jahan has been in North Korea. She's met Kim Il Sung and all of that, and the church is committed to a non-military but reconciliation, reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And I said, based on that, and based on the fact that it seems like we're both being targeted by similar people, my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, is widely accused of being a cult and all kinds of crazy stuff. I said, let's talk. And it's been an interesting journey for me, I will say. It's a kind of place I would not normally go, but we've done a lot of great work together around, pushing for this tunnel under the Bering Sea, which is a project that Reverend Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan have been dedicated to, in terms of reaching out, and encouraging peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. So it's very exciting. And I feel like we're in territory in America in terms of politics and religion that is just kind of uncharted waters. A lot of people are doing what you're doing and starting podcasts about religion. There's widespread interest in religion in America right now. People are listening to podcasts about Buddhism, about Orthodox Christianity, about Catholicism, about Islam, various interpretations of Islam. There's widespread interest in religion all across America, especially among people our age and younger. But church attendance right now among all churches and all organized religion is very low. And so at the same time that people are very, very interested in religion, they're also very, 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 very off-put and kind of alienated from existing religious institutions. And I think that means we're kind of at a turning point. The way people relate to religious topics is changing. And that means the work that you do on your channel, just kind of talking about your church's interpretation of the Bible, is very, very important, because people seem to be taking these ideas more seriously than they used to. I grew up in a small town, and a lot of people, they just went to the church their parents went to, and that they went there because their parents went there, and their parents went there because their parents went there, and people just kind of accepted things. But it seems like now people are thinking about religion on a level that they haven't thought about things before. And your church in particular, with the divine principle, right? That it has a very serious, well thought out, theology, right? Do you want to talk about that? Why it is that the ideas that your church puts out are a little bit more engaging than some of the more mainstream religions out there?
Yeah, this trend that you mentioned about how people are interested in religion, but church attendance is still low. I think Reverend Moon foresaw that decades ago. He only built a church because he felt that was the only way to, share his teachings. He tried to network with Christians in South Korea. That didn't work out too well at all. But then in the late 90s, he announced this crazy idea that the era of the church is over. He announced that very clearly when he made the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, that, legally speaking, nonprofit 501c3 in 1996. He meant it to be the starting point of the dissolution of the Unification Church, legally known as Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. Everyone was very shocked. And of course, that's a very radical idea that, okay, dissolve the church in favor of what? In favor of, in his view, a federation of families. And to describe a federation, I always go back to Star Trek. I love Star Trek. You have the United Federation of Planets. Every system has has to apply for membership. You have to agree to the basic tenets of the federation, which is largely, of course, there's corruption stuff you find out in some of the shows, but in an idealistic way, the idea is, everyone is going to peacefully cooperate despite all the different cultures and languages and everything. And if you can meet those qualifications, the federation can protect you, but you can have your own independent system, independent trade. That's how I kind of think of Reverend Moon's idea of a federation of families centered on common ideals such as God, family, the teachings in the divine principle. Now, has that worked out practically in the Unification Church? It's been much slower than, the proclamation of, dissolution of church. But then you have people in the 2010s who, for example, like Jordan Peterson, who captivated the minds of countless young men. And he's very religious, but he's very anti-institutional religion. He gets a lot of his, thinking from Carl Jung, who was a psychologist who kind of operated the same way. He described himself as religious, but not a member of a specific church. And even people like Jordan Peterson, when he's questioned about, do you believe in God? Are you a Christian? He just refuses to answer because he feels like it's a trap. He feels like institution ideology is a trap. So there's this trend that I really feel you pointed out that's really happening. And I think the Unification Church and Unificationism kind of was ahead of the curve, at least in a, the realm of ideas.
Hmm.
So because divine principle, although the actual black book exposition of the divine principle is primarily written for a Christian audience in South Korea, the teachings within it are designed, according to Reverend Moon, to transcend all religions, transcend all boundaries. He even instructed certain unificationist theologians to write versions of the divine principle for other religions. For example, one unificationist wrote a divine principle for Muslims.
Mm.
There's another member who is in the works of devising divine principle for Hindus. And Reverend Moon's background is very Confucius and Buddhist, and you see a lot of that, particularly in the first chapter of the Divine Principle, which talks about how the world was originally meant to be created.
Mm.
There's a lot of, even the nature of God is very rooted in the yin and yang Tao symbol.
Mm.
So the universality of Reverend Moon's thought in the Divine Principle kind of, to me, shows he was looking to the future where church, institutional religion would break down, and that there needs to be something universal to unite religions around some sort of common value. And the same thing with political parties, with the left wing and the right wing. Reverend Moon, very staunch anti-communist, anti-Marxist, especially in the 70s and 80s. And yet he could meet people like Gorbachev. He could meet people like Kim Il-sung.
Hmm.
He could meet these people in part because he had this kind of uniting ideology,
Yeah.
this uniting teaching. And because of that, even now, the Unification Church is one of the few pe- places, people, whatever you want to call the Unification Church, that has some sort of, friendly, if you want to use the term, relationship with North Korea, at least as friendly as
Yeah.
it can get. So,
Yeah.
and even some people speculate that will Kim Jong Un step in with this whole Hak Jahan detainment thing? I mean,
Mm.
some people have been speculating about that, and will that happen? I don't know, probably not. But that's kind of the contribution that unificationism offers. That's why I talk about it on my channel, because it can bridge religious divides and political divides centered on that common value, which is peace.
Yeah.
What you're doing and what the Center of Political Innovation is doing, especially with Russia, is non-violent means towards peace.
Hmm.
And you have some of, and I've looked at some of your content, some of your literature. You do have, and might surprise viewers who know that the Unification Church is so anti-communist, to
Hmm.
have someone like you who embraces some Marxist principles to
Hmm.
collaborate with unificationists. But the key is you're trying to seek it in a non-violent way, just like we are.
Yeah.
And there are those tenets in in Marxism, for example, but if you can move past that, then there's definitely some common ground, I would say, absolutely, for nonviolent peace. And that's what we could use with Russia. We definitely need that with Russia. The
Yeah.
Ukrainian war is dragged out far too long. It's getting ridiculous.
Yeah.
Nonviolent peace, not treating Russia as an enemy, even though the Cold War ended. And like, we need to invite them to play in the international stage peacefully, give them a chance to follow the rules, which never happened after the Cold War. They were still treated as the enemy. NATO was still around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and you're absolutely right. And that, all these old categories, after I spoke at a peace rally that Reverend Milhan Stevens organized with some New York City clergy, I was attacked in some communist blogs like, "Oh, how dare Caleb work with the Unification Church?" And so my response was to show them the emails. Because Notatal, which is the Communist Korean American Association of New York City, they had a rally when the previous president of South Korea came to meet with Joe Biden, and we politely emailed them as the Center for Political Innovation and said, "Can we come to your rally?" And they responded very nastily with all kinds of internet gossip. And I said, well, look, we wanted to work with the leftists around peaceful Korean Peninsula, and they sent us this nasty email. And that there's a spiritual, and this is something that I really appreciate, that when I read the anti-communist literature of the Unification Church, there's a critique of the Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism, which I never really believed in, and I never really took it seriously. And I came back to my Christian faith in 2015, and I never really got to the essence of that. But dialectical materialism says that all change comes through conflict, right? All change is through conflict. And because of that, right, it leads to a kind of destructive way of being. And that, when you look at the woke people, they don't like North Korea, they don't like Stalin, they don't like Russia, but they still have that mindset of like, we're going to go out and fight everybody, and we've been wronged. And so we're going to take down the people who wronged us. And they have this kind of vengeful, rage filled politics. And that is in a way a descendant of Marxism, even though they don't really believe in Marx's economic theories or anything like that, but they carry with them like the spiritual energy of Marxism. Whereas the communist countries, especially after the Second World War, a lot of them realized that you can't build a society that way. The Cultural Revolution in China was an absolute disaster, right? Where basically everyone was being told to rebel, right? And students were persecuting their teachers, and children were turning in their parents, and everyone was terrified of being attacked. It was almost like mob rule. And that, in China now, if you listen to the ideology they espouse, they're not preaching rebellion. They're preaching kind of unity, like we're one nation, all coming together. And the other thing, I mean, my new book that I'm going to read from later, this is about, it's called Mystical Stalinism, because in Russia now, a lot of people really like Stalin. Stalin is wildly popular. But most of the people who like Stalin are not communists. There's like a small communist party in Russia. It's one of the major political parties, but it's got like maybe a fourth of the seats in the parliament. They like Stalin because they think he was a communist. But a lot of Russians believe that Stalin converted to Christianity, which is not the official position of the Russian government, which is actually not the Russian Orthodox Church's position, but there's legends of Christian Stalin throughout Russia, and that people see Stalin when he broke with Trotsky and Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, and the way Stalin kind of unified the nation to drive out the Nazi invaders. They see that as almost an expression of Stalin, like kind of breaking with the dialectical Marxist way of doing things and kind of embracing kind of Christian and Russian Orthodox values. I find that to be really, really fascinating. And I wish, this book is just kind of just barely, it's mainly touching on it in relation to the American communist movement at the time and how it changed. But I almost wish I had time to go over to Russia and just really investigate this legend, because I find it fascinating. Like, there are churches where they have images of Stalin with a halo around his head. There are legends. There are people who survived the Battle of Stalingrad or World War II and say they saw angels like shooting down Nazi tanks with lightning bolts and things like that. It's fascinating to me. And that a lot of the people who like Stalin, they like him in a very kind of conservative way. They see him as like the father of the nation, the unifier, and that also what's interesting is the woke people, a lot of the stuff that they believe and a lot of the things that communist governments believe don't line up. For example, the LGBT thing, the communist countries very much largely believe that is a conspiracy to bring them down. Cuba is very, very tolerant of LGBT stuff. They have gay marriage and things like that. But, the gay marriage, they don't have that in Venezuela. They don't have that in Belarus. They don't have that in China. I believe homosexuality is still actually illegal in China. Technically, they don't really enforce it. They don't go around persecuting gay people, but it is technically illegal from what I understand. And that, George Soros is the guy who's funding a lot of the woke activist groups. And he was involved in bringing down the various communist governments in Eastern Europe in 1989. He funneled money to the protests and all of that. So things don't exactly add up. And like Tucker Carlson, right? He's a conservative, but he's one of the most sympathetic people to Russia and opposing U.S. regime change wars who's out there. Whereas a lot of these people that are out in the streets for Black Lives Matter and they're happy to go break windows for whatever the latest trendy cause is on CNN, you ask them about any country in the world that the U.S. media hates and they hate it too, right? They just it's almost like their anger and their desire to tear things down over here almost lines up with the wars around the world. They want to tear things down around the world and tear things down over here, right? Maybe it's that permanent revolution that Trotsky talked about. I don't know. And that my understanding, and you know way more about this than I do, but my understanding is that Reverend Moon's critique of dialectical materialism, he didn't just say it was wrong, right? He had his own understanding of something he called, like, was it unity, division, or origin, division, union? Is that correct?
Yep, origin, division, union, unity of opposites through the
Okay.
logic of what he called give and receive, where opposites, instead of coming into conflict, they give and receive in
Hmm.
harmony. And that's actually how you get unity and development.
Wow. Can you talk more about that? Can you explain that in a little more detail?
Yeah, so uh, that is the logic in unificationist anti-communist literature, but in divine principle, the idea of origin, division, union, action starts from God. So it gives the idea that when God created human beings, God, the origin, has duality, right? Going back to the yin and yang symbol. If
Okay.
God is a being of duality, and Reverend Moon and divine principle gets this from the Bible, where everything's made in the image of God. Okay, what's everything around us? Is that every living thing in pairs? Okay, it looks like it for the most part. So then God must be a dual being of positivity, negativity, internal or invisible, external, invisible, and as well male and female. So God, the origin, divides in two in the physical universe because we're all made in the image of God. But then the opposites in the physical universe, whether it's protons and electrons, or uh, uh, what do you call it? Stamen and pistil, or
Hmm.
male and female animals. And then same with human beings. To produce something, not just a union, but children, you need man and woman coming together, opposites. So that's kind of how you get that origin, division, union action.
Hmm.
And so when you look at the development of history, you could argue, okay, you have an origin point of the world, and then you have opposites. You have good versus evil. You have conflicting sides. Does that mean that they're always continually in conflict, or is that conflict, which does occur throughout history, is that conflict seeking something higher, a higher standard of goodness? Divine principle would argue, and unificationism would say yes, because God is guiding history. The inevitable conflict and wars between the greater standard of goodness and the lesser standard of goodness, uh, you know, if there's a difference in standard, they will collide. But the fruit is that there's a progression in history. And then ideally that conflict stops. And rather than the two opposites, coming together in conflict, they harmonize in unity based on the original principle of creation, which would be God's original intention for opposites in the world, plus and minus, male and female, internal and external, rather than becoming in conflict, to unite. Another example is how it treats religion and science. For history, it seems like it's been in conflict. Once the emergence of science came about, it was like, well, all these myths are not true, and how can the Bible literally have happened the way it did? But more recently, over the past few decades, you've started to see, rather than a conflict, a sort of unity seeking to be formed.
Hmm.
Unificationism tries to do that. Other people try and do that. And so that's kind of the antidote for the dialectic seen in Marxist ideology, which
Hmm.
says that the only way to really bring about change is just keep struggling, keep struggling, keep struggling.
Right.
Unificationism says, okay, stop struggling, give and receive in unity centered on something higher. In unificationism, religion, so God,
Right.
or a higher value, and that will create the peace and unity that people are seeking. If you just keep going into conflict, bad results will happen.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I'm gonna ask you, since it is a religious topic, but it's certainly related to
Sure.
politics. Lately on this channel, we've been talking about well, the whole Epstein scandal, right?
Yep.
And that a lot of what we're seeing from the Epstein scandal seems to come right out of the Old Testament, right? If you read the Old Testament, there was
Yeah.
this group of people, the children of Israel. Among them, they would start worshiping this god Baal, or there was another god named
There's
Moloch.
Baal, there's Moloch. Moloch's a big one that people like Alec Jones has talked about for years, saying that people in Hollywood and the elites, they literally worship Moloch, Old Testament figure.
Yeah, and that it appears that Jeffrey Epstein, in addition to his human trafficking of minors, that he was engaged in human sacrifices of some type and some kind of human sacrificing ritual. And then the name Baal, Ball, is
Yep.
in his emails. Some people wonder if it's a typo or they just put it in there or whatnot. And there's other references to ceremonies and satanic rituals and
Oh,
such.
wow.
And people look at that, and I mean, it's just horrifying. And I mean, the way this guy seemed to be so indifferent to other people's suffering. I mean, treating people as like literal slaves that he's using to bribe politicians with and blackmail them and all of that. But I mean, it appears that what the prophet Jeremiah was urging Israel to repent from is back, right? I mean, it looks like this is like an Old Testament Bible story happening before us in real life, that the rulers of the nation are corrupt. I mean, it's kind of surprising to see, and it's right there. And what's crazy is the whole country is reading these files, and we're horrified. But there's a desire to just kind of move along. No arrests have been made. I mean, it's. I mean, what do you make of all of this?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I it's insane, honestly. I mean, the big overall my picture is essentially when you have shadows in a society, the longer they stay hidden, the worse it gets. Just like in the unification movement, you had shadows surrounding the coercive donation practices and corruption of certain leaders in the movement.
Okay.
Now, because it's been hidden for so many years, it's crashed down and it's harming, Hak Jahan, a genuine spiritual leader.
Hmm.
Same thing with the Epstein files. It's like these shadows from the ruling class elites of our Western society have been there for decades. There have been rumors and they've just been called conspiracy theories of, Alex Jones, one of the original, people who that people remember who were, talking about we filmed this. There's, the elites, they're worshiping Moloch, they're sacrificing babies. There was a someone on Joe Rogan's podcast even recently that said, yeah, like people in Hollywood, they do like, blood sacrifice rituals, really Old Testament stuff.
Yeah.
Now it's coming out, and now people are freaking out because it's like, oh my gosh, like it's real. Like it's almost like people's psyches in part can't handle it. But as to, the arrests and all that, I mean, who knows? I mean,
Hmm.
I mean, in the end, President Trump is in charge.
Yeah.
So the question, and he promised, like everyone else on the Republican side of the aisle, to release the Epstein files. Now that it's shown how crazy it is, I mean, I really doubt that President Trump, for example, knew how dark it went, because this
Mm.
is really dark stuff. Like, and it's like to have people that are influential in society worshiping Old Testament deities is like that's to unpack that is like that takes so long to unpack that and process that. So on the one hand, it's like, okay, you find out what's really in there. Now what do you do? Well, you're making it worse. The more like the whole process of removing these shadows has been terrible. Like you
Hmm.
got to rip the band-aid off, man. You got to rip
Mm.
it off because now no one now there's huge distrust. If Donald Trump under his administration just released all of them immediately, you would not have all these, people online having all these, hysteria and like taking so many things out of context. Like for example, a little email here and people are like, "Oh, this person's guilty," but it's like, "Well, no, it's just an email. It doesn't mean anyone did anything." But then there's other things where you know, there's clear allegations that someone did something, and it's like, wow, we'll still let them walk free. It's like the delay in removing this shadow from our society has become a big problem.
Yeah.
Now
Well.
people don't even trust what's now people don't even trust what's in the Epstein files. There was all this talk of like, release them, we're gonna have all this information. But because they delayed it, and you have Cash Patel saying, "Oh, Epstein killed himself. We know it." And like, "Oh, there are no Epstein files," Pam Bondi said. And it's like you set yourself up for total distrust. What do you expect the American people to do? Just suddenly trust you?
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous. That's how I make of it. It's just we're not ripping off the band-aid. We're and so as a result, people do not trust even what's in the Epstein files, and more hysteria, mistrust, confusion is just going to spread, which is going to make it more difficult for the people of America to trust if ever the government actually goes after any of these people, which at some point they got to start doing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I think about the sacrificing of an infant baby, I try to understand that spiritually, because I feel like, when you look at so much of what Jesus's message was about, it was about love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, forgive your enemy, have empathy, have compassion, think about how other people feel. And so when someone takes an infant baby and kills an infant baby because they believe it will bring them good luck or it'll result in them getting more money or whatnot, that requires them to like kill a part of themselves spiritually, right? And that you almost can view it almost not in a spiritual sense, in like a psychological sense. If someone can psych themselves out to just become so brutal and inhuman to do something like that, they can then go on and treat other people ruthlessly and gain from it, right? And that I think about, because infanticide was a really big part of the ancient world, right? In ancient Greece and ancient Rome and ancient Egypt, babies were killed all the time. Generally, it was like if a baby was deformed in any way, or if the family didn't think they had enough food for it, they would throw the baby in the river or something like that. That was a big part of the ancient world.
Yeah,
And
but in other cultures, I should add, in
yeah.
other cultures, as the Mayans and the Aztecs, it was ritualized.
Mm,
Every year, you would offer children to the sun god.
mm.
Yeah, and it was this idea of sacrifice your best so that the best can come to the society in a ancient world perverse kind of way.
Yeah, and that one thing was in ancient Rome they had infanticide. But I guess I wanted to say this one thing that many people have pointed out about the Bible and about the religions that originate in the Middle East during this time, is that a lot of the stories that became popular involve babies that are left to die who grow up to do great things. Like Romulus and Remus, the founders of the Roman Empire, were left by the river to die
Yep.
by their father, and then they went on to become great leaders. Abraham, or I think it was Moses, was put in the river in a
Hmm.
basket, and then he goes on to be the Prince of Egypt. And that the idea was that that was comforting to people because of this horrific reality of infanticide that was part of everyday life. But the other thing was that in ancient Rome, the Roman Empire practiced infanticide and actually required it of any deformed baby. If any baby was born
Hmm.
deformed, you had to kill it,
Yep.
or else,
Sparta was the same way. Yep.
yeah, or else you were punished somehow because you were potentially corrupting the gene pool. It was almost like eugenics. And so then, but as Rome became Christianized, they did the opposite, and they ended up outlawing infanticide, and that was part of the Christianization of Rome, was that they were outlawing it. And so I think of what clearly, the fact that so many satanic rituals involve that, it's almost like urging people to kill the compassionate, kind, and caring part in themselves in order to become ruthless. That's what I almost see that
Mm.
ritual as doing. And the other thing is that, when we talk about Satanism, right? I always point out to people, Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, in his book about what Satanism was, he said Satanism was radical individualism. It was the belief that compassion is weakness, that, kindness is for suckers, is for fools, just be purely selfish, right? And he encouraged his followers to study Ayn Rand and the objectivist, the atheistic objectivism of Ayn Rand, and that kind of radical individualism, right? And it says that there is no truth, that truth is just kind of defined by human will, and that we can kind of make our own truth, and that anyone who tries to tell you any truth and set out any moral principles or truth for you is being totalitarian and violating your rights as an individual. And the truth and right and wrong are set by bold individuals who just go out. And as Friedrich Nietzsche talks about this, this is when you talk about Satanism, you're talking about a viewpoint that rejects morality, that worships the individual self, and gets rid of any empathy or kindness or compassion. That when I see Satanism, I see that as what it is. And so when I look at these rituals, it's almost like completing the circle for me. Like it all makes sense, right? And that Jesus's message is, live for the sake of others, kindness, compassion, love your neighbor as yourself. And you have all these different voices that have said, well, if you do that, you're a fool. You can never really walk in your neighbor's shoes. If you do that, people will take advantage of you. That's kind of the battle we're in a world where forces that really kind of reject their basic human empathy have gained dominance. That's how I'm starting to interpret this. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think there's some truth to that because whenever the baby, not necessarily in the Roman story, but in the Bible, whenever the baby is cast in the river basket, it's always accompanied by a mass infanticide.
Mm,
You have the killing of the firstborns at the time of Moses, and you have King Herod's decree at the time of Jesus. Mass infanticide. And so that came to mind as kind of there are evil forces that will strike through infanticide. If you're a Christian, and I this is my viewpoint as well. I don't know where you stand on this issue, but abortion,
mm,
mass infanticide. If you're a Christian, that's what
mm,
it is, plain and simple, and it's happened since the 1970s. So there's this mass infanticide, and people like Alex Jones, I've mentioned him a few times. And the reason why I've mentioned him a few times is because, once again, he was kind of the first alarm bell of, hey guys, this may sound crazy, but all this is happening. None of you believe me right now, but I'm telling you, all of this Old Testament, Baal Moloch worship is happening. And
hmm
infanticide's happening at the same time. And now a lot of what he said about that is, and other people have said it too, has come to light. And when he was asked by Tucker Carlson about kind of what was going on in the world, he went very spiritual. He gave a very spiritual perspective, and how like there's like anti-human forces out there in the spirit world
mm,
that are or whatever you want to call it, that are influencing people. And unificationism would argue that in the last days, which it argues we are in the final moments of you know the history of conflict, you have a mass entry of spirits from the spirit world. That's the unificationist perspective that influence everything and everyone. That's kind of the only thing that gives me a sort of logic. And you're kind of pointing it out too. It's like, what's this spirit? It's the spirit of pure individualism.
mm,
Sacrifice anything else for the individual. And that's kind of what these elites in, for example, Hollywood and Jeffrey Epstein circles seem to be doing. And it's tied to the Old Testament. And that's so bizarre. It's like
mm,
you would not, it's like child sacrifice was totally outlawed by Yahweh in the Old Testament. Totally outlawed. And one of the problems of worshiping Baal was this child sacrifice. Some Israelites were doing child sacrifice. And the other interesting part of this discussion, too, is that from an academic perspective, Baal was a recognized deity in Israelite society for many years.
mm,
In the end, the Southern Israelites won because the North was wiped out, and you have the Southern Israelites' writings. But from an academic perspective, the divide and the issue of solely worshiping Yahweh or worshiping other deities like Baal was a really intense discussion.
mm,
It was really intense, and so it's so fascinating to find Baal pop up in the Epstein files because you know Baal doesn't just represent like the satanic false deity that the Israelites were worshiping that in the eyes of the ancient Israelites was a real entity, a B'nai Elohim, it's called. If you read some scholars like Dr. Michael Heiser, who really focuses on the ancient Israelite perspective in interpreting the Bible, Baal they understood as a real deity, real spiritual entity, a B'nai Elohim, a son of God from the spiritual realm. Basically this scholar puts out the idea that there's God's spiritual family with which rebelled, which we commonly know as angels, B'nai Elohim to be accurate, and then the human family rebelled as well. And
mm,
that's why there's that strange passage in Genesis 6, chapter 4, where these Nephilim, these kind of half intermixings between angels and human women were formed, and God was really upset about that. But for them, they really thought these entities were real, and they were just, more angels, B'nai Elohim, that were meant to govern on behalf of God, but rebelled and sought worship. and which is why they're wrong and which is why they're false deities. But in the modern Christian context, we just think of Baal as like, a false god, a false deity. Just, it's just like the golden calf, like a statue they made. Like, no, no,
Right.
no. The people who wrote the Bible thought they were real entities that were in opposition to God's will.
Hmm.
So it's possible that if you embrace a spiritual side to things, that even if you're not a unificationist and the unificationist, understanding of the spirit world, or even if you're a Christian and you kind of retreat from the notion of spiritual entities, which many Christians do because it makes sense that it's easier just to focus on the deity or the entity of Satan, I should say. It's much easier, but from the ancient Israelite perspective, there were a lot more than that, and they were wreaking havoc, and they're going to come back at the end of time because they know that defeat is imminent.
Hmm.
That was a little bit of a theological tangent there. Maybe audience is
Oh,
not used to it. I know the YouTube audience is, my friend Mike, who I did a video on, he's in our chat now.
oh,
He who
good.
is like God, he's in there. There's a lot of theological discussion in the chat right now on YouTube, at least. So I'm
Oh, I'm
glad the
sure.
viewers are engaged.
Yeah, no, and that's we wanted to have you on to bring your perspective and talk about events in South Korea. But let me circle back to that. Would you say, do you think it is these satanic entities that are within our government? Are they the ones that are driving the persecution of Dr. Hak Jahan? Do you see that connection, or is it yet to be seen?
In my mind, it's yet to be seen. I mean, I will say there are unificationists, just regular followers like myself,
Hmm.
who do say, like, okay, President Lee and the South Korean administration, they're possessed by some evil dark spirit. And, because unificationists see Hak Jahan as a very, historical figure, a
Hmm.
very important figure for God's work in the world. So, but in my view, I don't know. You've gotten me to think about that, actually.
Okay.
And the spiritual side to what's going on, not just with Epstein and his files, but also what's going on in South Korea. Because I mean, the opposition, there is a common thread, I will say. There's a taking advantage of shadows within an institution,
Hmm.
governmental institutions here, Unification Church institution in South Korea. There
Right.
are evil forces that are taking advantage of shadows and sins of people, in those institutions, but are using it to just totally destroy religion and God. Like, you can't have that in a society. You can't have that. You can't be unfriendly to religion, and you can't twist religion to your own machinations, because President Lee in South Korea has said openly, you know, he wants the government to approve and disapprove, legally speaking, religions. And of course,
Wow.
who's at the top of the list of those who are to be excluded and dissolved? The Unification Church, and as well another church in Chunchi.
Hmm.
Bye bye. We think you are a harmful influence on the society. So guess what? We as the government get to dissolve you. Antithetical to anything in the American Constitution, that's for sure, which
Yeah.
forbids the government to do so. But it's totally, using religion for its own purposes. And maybe that kind of happened with the elites surrounding Jeffrey Epstein.
Hmm.
Maybe something like that was happening where, you know there are religious elements to what was going on, uh, with him and, everyone associated with him. There are religious elements, demonic religious elements, and it's
Hmm.
almost like, the religious sphere is being used and twisted to, meld something that he wants, something that those people, you know or whatever's influencing them is seeking after.
Yeah, well, when we talk about how young people and people our age and younger are more interested in religion, I almost view this as like this is like full circle, because I remember when the new atheist movement started when I was in college, when Richard Dawkins was suddenly on TV, and that all of a sudden there was this widespread criticism of religion everywhere in a way that had never been. It used to be kind of a faux pas. If a celebrity said they didn't believe in God or something, that was like, ooh, like that was kind of scandalous, but now, but suddenly there was just this wave of atheism, and Bill Maher and all these people. and it kind of turned into mockery, right? In a lot of cases, very crude and kind of nasty mockery. And you had a lot of like young men, who grew up in religious families, and perhaps they were like smarter and felt that, more bookish, and felt they'd been bullied, and like they were smarter than everybody else, and they were atheists, and all the people around them were dumb, and that this was their like revenge on the world, kind of. But then a lot of those young men ended up becoming alt-right, right? A lot of them went into the alt-right movement. Some of them went into the wokeist movement, but it seemed like, and now everyone's kind of like lost, right? Because everything's gotten so shrill. And so it's almost like a lot of people are kind of circling back. And that was my story too. I mean, I was quite an atheist when I was a young man. And it took me a long time to kind of rediscover my faith. But I think it's just that you in a way it's almost like maturing, right? When faith is immature, when faith is naive, right, it has to be challenged, right? And that's kind of like what you were getting at before about like the unity of opposites, right? You need to be challenged. You can't have a tall without a short, right? You can't have a long or without short. I guess short is also, but you can't have wet without dry, right? And that, so there's duality, but there's also an element of like, like Michael Jordan was this amazing basketball player. But if they'd made a rule that he was only allowed to play basketball with kindergartners, after 2 or 3 years, he wouldn't be a very good basketball player because he'd never been challenged, right? And that you have to stay challenged. When you go lift weights at the gym, it's that heavy weight, pushing against you that makes you stronger. And that a lot of the faith that a lot of people had prior to the new atheist movement was very naive, right? It was very naive. And I remember like at my college, Campus Crusade for Christ had an event where they had like an ex-gay speaker, and the LGBT organization, was there debating them, and a lot of the answers they gave were just like, you don't understand, right? It's like explaining astrophysics to an ant. You just can't understand. You just have to have faith, and that's not going to work for people. And and the other argument that I would hear from religious people a lot was religious folks would say, well, if you don't believe in God and there is no God, nothing happens. But if you do believe, or if you don't believe in God and there is no God, nothing happens. But if you don't believe in God and there is a God, then you go to hell. So you should probably, just to edge your bets, you should believe in God. And I would always say to people, that's not belief, right? If your wife says to you, do you love me? And you say, well, if I don't love you, the consequence is blank. So I guess to hedge my bets, I'll love you. I mean, it's
Oh
not
my God.
sincere, right? And that I think it was like a lot of the naive things had to be pushed away in order for people to really connect and really believe, right? You can't have a superficial belief to have a real belief. That makes me think about something else I read. Thomas Carlyle, who's one of my favorite writers, the Scottish intellectual. He talked about why is it that all these ancient prophets went around destroying idols, right? And he told the story of like all these ancient prophets are going around smashing idols. And he says, what was this about, right? And that, the prophet Muhammad destroyed all the idols in the temple of Mecca, and that, Jeremiah is smashing idols, Moses is smashing idols, all these, why are they doing this? And he says, well, do we really think that ancient humans were stupid? They could carve a piece of wood in their backyard and that would be God. They could just take a stone and make it God. No, these idols originally stood for principles and truths. They were like a symbol to remind people of a higher, more powerful spiritual reality. But as the generations went on, the praying to the idol became routine, right? So, and it became routine, it became meaningless. People forgot what it was really about. They were just kind of going through the motions. So the prophet came along and smashed the idol so that he could connect the people with the higher truth that the idol had originally stood for. And I find that to be kind of profound. I feel like maybe that's the period we're living in. A lot of the kind of routine religion has been swept away. So now people can really discover the principles for themselves. What do you think?
Oh, that's totally true. I mean, that's the premise of the divine principle from the very start.
Hmm.
It warns that Christianity, as it stands today, or today meaning in the 50s, is at its limit. And it's going to be challenged because science is coming. And, they're going to, you're right. You can't just have like, oh, just have faith, or, just do it. It's just not right. It's like, you're leaving room for someone like Richard Dawkins to come on the scene. And it took a lot of time for there to be a successful opposition to the new atheist movement, which, the new atheist movement has a lot of holes in it.
Yeah.
But nothing could arise quickly because there was that kind of attitude of faith. And, you had, I mean, yes, I would say, oh, well, unificationism has the divine principle, but it wasn't necessarily that widespread enough to counter something like the New Atheist movement. I mean, it tried with its literature, its anti-communist literature, its anti-atheist literature, in addition to the divine principle, but it's only so far it's spread. So, but in the recent years, you've had people, modern intellectuals, specifically centered around, gaining the following of young men in particular, refuting the claims of the new atheists, such as
Mhm.
Richard Dawkins. And
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins hasn't given up, but he's kind of an old croak at this point. And, will there be anyone to replace him, or will the rise in this interest in religion of young people, especially, not necessarily rooted in a church, but rooted in the actual ideals and principles behind religion, will that continue to rise? I think it will. And I hope the world, can benefit from that, because there have been, of course, many times in the world's history where, the world has not necessarily benefited from a zealous following of religion, but if it sticks to seeking a higher truth, seeking principle, seeking, the actual living God, and not so much an institution, or in Reverend Moon's words, if it goes more towards the end of the era of church and into the era of families,
Mhm.
perhaps there's hope for the
Yeah.
religious sphere, and hope to have nonviolent peace, which, hopefully is the goal of religions in general. Peace in the soul, peace in the world.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Luke, it has been so great to have you on, and I hope that you will come back on when there are updates in the case.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as when there are updates and all that, and people should go subscribe to Luke's channel,
Thank
because
you.
Luke is doing videos all the time. If you liked what we were just talking about, get into his channel because he gets a lot deeper with all of this, and he has
Thank you.
people on who don't agree with him, and they go back and forth. It's good stuff. You should check it out. So go subscribe to Luke's channel, Seeking the 12 Gates. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure I'll run into you again, if not in Boston, in New York, or some other place. So I wish you the best in all that you do. Stay strong. Sound good?
Yes, thank you. You stay strong as well. Have
Yep.
a good rest
Thanks,
of the
Luke.
show. See you all later, audience members.
Yeah, that was
Bye-bye.
fun. Yeah, that was great.